Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our latest session in our series, Why Marx? This week, we're looking at the First International, Marx and Engels' interaction with the First International, and Roger's going to give a little glimpse of what happened with the other internationals. Very pleased to have Roger with us tonight, who's a member of too many groups and campaigns to list, but he's also involved in the Labour Left Alliance and, of course, the Workers' International Network, and stood for the Labour Party, NEC. Couple of years ago, 3 years ago, it seems like an eternity, doesn't it? So much has happened in that time. So welcome, Roger, and thank you for addressing this meeting.
Okay, well, good evening, comrades. I think we should start by saying the elementary starting point to a review of the international organizations of the working class is to understand that the ideas of socialism and internationalism were not foisted artificially on the workers by Marxists. They sprang organically out of the aspirations of the working class, and who were, thrown together without property, dependent for their survival on solidarity and struggle. And the genius of Marx and Engels consisted in drawing scientific and historical conclusions from the instinctive and unrefined socialist aspirations of the working class from its very birth. Now, the first International Association of Workers, we have to do a little bit of the prehistory before we come to the International itself, was a group called the Federation of the Just. And it drew its inspiration from the first stirrings, not even of the industrial working class, but of craftsmen about to fall into the proletariat, who are articulating in anticipation the social needs of their future class. And it consisted of militant refugees from savage reaction in Germany, the left wing of the English Chartists, and even left Jacobins from the French Revolution, who formed that organization, which was itself a historical milestone and an inspiration to Marx and Engels in their efforts to apply the dialectical method to history while countering Hegelian idealism. And it was after tireless and patient exploration by Marx and Engels, as Europe tottered on the brink of the great revolutionary conflagration of 1848, that organization measured up for the challenge and transformed itself, renamed itself, the Communist League, and proclaimed as its aim, quote, the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, rule of the proletariat, abolition of the old bourgeois society based on class antagonisms, and the foundation of a new society without classes and without private property. It changed its motto from all men are brothers to workers of all countries unite. It also adopted a genuinely democratic centralist constitution, far from the abusive caricature practiced by some later organizations, including the election of the right of recall over all officers, common adherence to all league decisions after democratic discussion, and the requirement of, quote, revolutionary energy and zeal on the part of every member. And if any proof were needed that this form of organization was not the arbitrary invention of Marx or Lenin, but the highest expression of working class morality, springing naturally from its ingrained traditions of collective will, solidarity, and its corollary democracy, we need only remember that the Communist League actually had to warn Marx and Engels themselves of disciplinary action if they delayed in writing the Communist Manifesto, which they were commissioned to write in December 1847, and which, after all, to do them justice, they did manage to already publish just in time for the revolution in February 1848. And with the influx of refugees from reaction into London, fleeing from counter-revolution in Germany, France, Poland, Italy, Hungary, etc., it became a truly cosmopolitan organization, and really, you could say, a pre-international. Now, the Communist League had been a creation by the pioneers and forerunners of the world working class, built by the great events of 1848 around the most prominent theoretical cadres of the movement, Marx and Engels. And yet already in 1852, after the Cologne Communist trial and the triumph of continental-wide reaction, that worthy organization collapsed, destroyed by the counter-revolution. And it was 12 years before a new international organization of the working class once again emerged. And only the few adherents of Marx's ideas continued the scientific tradition. They represented the brain and the memory of the class, absorbing the lessons of the defeat and theoretically preparing the way for future battles. And when the International Working Men's Association, as it was called, the First International, was created in 1864, it wielded an influence incomparably greater than its precursor. So, contrary to conventional myth, the initiative to found the International came not from Marx and Engels, but directly from working class activists in England and France. And actually, Marx was, and this is the direct quote, Marx was respectfully requested by workers of the London Trades Council to attend the meeting which established the IWMA. And in fact, when he attended the first meeting, he didn't even speak. He attended, in his words, as a mute figure on the platform. And the function of that meeting was simply, it defined its function as simply to discuss questions of interest to the working class. So as is explained by, I must recommend this book, History of the International by Julius Braunthal. He said, for Marx, the importance of the International lay not so much in ideology or even policy, but in its very existence as an international center of the labor movement. And he took good care not to endanger it by allowing ideological differences to obtrude. That doesn't mean that, of course, that he didn't argue forcefully for his point of view and in contradiction to various false ideologies and ideas that were put forward. But he did not allow that to interfere with the actual practical activities of the International. So Marx and Engels worked very differently according to the different situations they were in. When they had been working in the Communist League prior to 1848, that was just a small cadre organization, a clandestine organization, and the nature of their work was not at all the same as when the First International was created, on the crest of a mass movement when all kinds of disparate ideas were being debated, from the trade unions in London to the Bakuninists, we'll say more about that later, to the Proudhonists and whoever else. As Engels explained, and this is again a direct quote, it was necessary to be bold in matter, but mild in manner. They worked not as a secret organized faction, but as an open tendency within the First International. Now, the First International's General Council consisted of a hodgepodge of very, very different elements. English trade unionists, French Proudhonists, that was a sect, which I don't want to spend time explaining too much about it because it really faded into history soon afterwards. Polish and Italian nationalists, later anarchists. And Marx compared it to the narrower prehistory of the International Communist League and concluded, again a quote from Marx, it will take time before the revival of the movement allows the old boldness of language to be used. We must be fortiter in re, suaviter in modo, that is, firm in principle, but mild in manner. And Engels, too, explained that the aim of the IWMA was, again, quote, to weld together into one huge army the whole militant working class of Europe and America. Therefore, it could not set out from the principles laid down in the Communist Manifesto. In other words, Marx and Engels were anything but sectarian. In the workshop of the First International, Marx and Engels applied the simple precepts of the Communist Manifesto when they said, the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. So what marked them out? Simply that they were, and again, open the quotes, on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of any country, and on the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. And as we'll see, this was not, of course, quite the same as the tasks facing Lenin in 1921 or Trotsky in 1938, whose avowed goal was necessarily to set up new parties to challenge the existing failed parties of the Second and Third Internationals, respectively. That, of course, is a subject of, no doubt, of future meetings. Because at that time, there was no crystallized labor bureaucracy entrenched at the head of the workers' movement, no caste with a stake in the status quo, prepared consciously to betray the workers. That's why there was no perspective of establishing new alternative revolutionary parties. However crass the blunders of the workers' leaders, even however criminal and unpardonable their mistakes, the opportunism of Lassalle, the putschism of Blanqui, the adventurism of Bakunin, etc. Nevertheless, they remain mistakes, not to be compared with the monstrous betrayals of the leaders of the Second and Third Internationals at a later stage. The IWMA consisted of all the nascent working class parties in the world. The objective of Marx and Engels was to participate in the fusing of all the disparate nascent workers' organizations around the world, no matter how limited, even outside the parameters of the working class, to encompass all genuine movements of protest against the existing order and unite all the existing embryonic organizations of resistance to capitalism into a single worldwide movement. And that at last provided them with a framework within which to pit what they considered their scientific ideas against those of the assorted sectarians peddling their own quack panaceas. Now, the First International lasted just 8 years. Its active membership was limited. Its funds were pitifully small. And yet, according again to the historian Brownthal, to millions of workers, it seemed a legendary power on which they placed boundless hopes. Governments saw it as a gigantic, menacing, mysterious power. European cabinets concocted plans for its extermination. In France and Spain, it was persecuted under special laws. In the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and in the German Empire, it was outlawed as a danger to the state. The Pope condemned it as the enemy of God and man. And of particular interest, the Times, which of course was represented not just the British bourgeoisie, but in a way it was the strongest bourgeoisie, almost the sole industrial bourgeoisie at that time in existence. The Times regarded its foundation as an event as world-shaking. Well, let's see what they say. Here's a direct quote. One has to go back to the time of the birth of Christianity to find anything analogous to this workers' movement. The aim of the International is nothing short of the rebirth of humanity, surely the most comprehensive aim to which any institution apart from the Christian Church has ever aspired. Compliments indeed. In the over in the USA, a Republican member of the House of Representatives, a future Attorney General, spoke of the great IWMA, an organization which extends over the whole of Europe, makes its voice heard everywhere, and its power felt in all circles. So, I mean, with the First International, socialism stepped onto the stage of history as a world movement. And yet, it was not even socialist at that point, not at its inception. The International consisted of English Owenites and Chartists, French Proudhonists and Blanquists, Irish nationalists, Polish patriots, Italian Mazzinists, German socialists, and as Marx put it, the English were against special privilege, the French against Bonapartism, the Irish against Britain, the Poles against Russia, the Italians against Austria, and the Germans against capitalism. And the International embraced English craft unions, French workers' cooperatives, scattered groups of German exiles, even Italian nationalists, Russian bomb-throwing anarchists. And quite apart from all manner of charlatans, heretics, and adventurers, even its most heroic groups of pioneer workers were confused. The Proudhonists of France and Spain and Belgium were opposed on principle to strikes. The Lassallians of Germany, who actually resisted persistent approaches to join the International, but they were secretly collaborating with the dictator Bismarck. The flamboyant intrigues of the anarchists in Russia, Bakunin, were eventually to come near to wrecking the organization. And the British trade unionists, as you can well understand, were frankly terrified by all manifestations of what they called continental socialism. But nevertheless, at its core stood the working class, and above all at that time, the British working class, which was showing solidarity with the victims of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and of Napoleon III's coup in France, and with the Polish uprising against the Russian Tsar, and particularly, of course, to their lasting and eternal honor, the solidarity with the North in the Civil War to outlaw slavery. Abraham Lincoln himself praised the nobility of the Lancashire cotton workers who actually starved voluntarily rather than break the blockade on the southern slave-owning cotton states during the American Civil War. And it grew, according to the grossly exaggerated estimates of a terrified ruling class, the International, in their imaginations at least, grew to between 5 and 8 million members. Now, in actual fact, the IWMA had few individual members, but just maybe a few hundreds in a few countries. But of course, it also had the affiliations of mass trade unions and of some political organizations. So the First International sprang out of the instinctive tendency of the maturing working class to recognize its common identity on a world scale. It was rooted in that elemental movement of solidarity above all among the British workers, as I've said, with the fight against slavery in the American Civil War, the Polish Rising against Russian Tsarist oppression, the revolutionary nationalist movements of Italy and of Austro-Hungary, the French workers languishing under the Bonapartist jackboot, etc. And it became the single world movement of organized labor, embracing the British trade unions. Well, I've given the list. No more convincing proof could be required of the patience, humility, and tact of Marx, who's so grossly libeled in the academic textbooks as a kind of mad fanatic who dreamed up his theories in the British Museum. So I've already quoted some of the solidarity actions of British workers. They protested at the Prime Minister Palmerston's conspiracy bill against political refugees. They demonstrated in support of Garibaldi, who was leading a movement to unify Italy. They demonstrated on the streets against Austrian repression and against the crushing by the Russian Tsar of the Polish rebellion. As I say, the textile workers suffered mass unemployment to resist British intervention in support of the US slaveholders. And that quote from Lincoln, he called their actions an exalted example of Christian heroism. So the Workers' Parties organized in the only way they could, along the lines of the fraternal self-organization of workers anywhere, when not distorted by bureaucratic interference, in accord with the principles of workers' democracy, free debate, and united action. And sure, the International was not free of human weaknesses. Along with heroism and solidarity and humor and comradeship, there were manifestations aplenty of vanity, pomposity, opportunism, sectarianism, cowardice, adventurism, and petty corruption. But the point is, there was no trace of any privileged officialdom hell-bent on systematic betrayal of the working class. That was to come, of course, later. In their day, Marx and Engels had to pit their scientific socialist ideas against the pet remedies of a range of cheap charlatans and snake oil salesmen. They had to challenge the quackery of Dühring, the opportunism of Lassalle, the adventurism of Blanqui, the flamboyant posturing of Bakunin, etc. And the workers' movement was many times put in peril by the cowardice, vanity, or treachery of such characters, by honest mistakes, and even perhaps by personal crimes, but by nothing more deep-rooted or sinister than that. And they managed in the 8 years of its existence to hammer the General Council into an authoritative political leadership. I'm coming to the most supreme example of that in a moment. But they hammered it into an authoritative political leadership, a vanguard of the world movement, which gave a lead and a direction to the rank and file. And of course, predictably, then as now, in whimpers later echoed by succeeding generations of petty bourgeois rebels, etc., this provoked accusation, particularly from the supporters of Bakunin, of arrogance, dictatorship, hierarchy, orthodoxy, authoritarianism, etc., etc. But the creation of the International was a momentous historical turning point, and it didn't take long before it became the crucial workshop in which the tools of analysis were forged and sharpened, the arena of furious debate against the background of the world's first workers' uprising. In the great laboratory of the first world working class movement, they concentrated theoretically the whole experience of the working class, pitted the ideas of scientific socialism against all the bogus cranks and eccentrics who had latched onto the movement with their charlatan potions. Marx called the 8 years of painstaking and tireless work in the International, which was the most creative 8 years of his life, moreover, because it was the time when he also brought forth the monumental work Capital. But he called it a continual struggle against the sects and amateur experiments which sought to assert themselves against the real movement of the working class. Striking workers affiliated en bloc after the General Council expressed support or launched collections for them, and the ruling class was thrown into panic as its growth accelerated day by day. And of course, the crucial test was the crucible of the Franco-Prussian War. The Franco-Prussian War, which broke out in 1870, was really a precursor or a forerunner of the First World War and the new era of imperialist slaughter. Now, the Brussels Congress of the International in 1870 called on the working class to initiate a general strike in the event of the outbreak of war. Particularly the French section, the Paris Federation, they made this proclamation, again, I'm directly quoting, "A war waged on account of dynastic interests is in the eyes of the workers nothing but criminal folly. Our split would only bring in its wake the complete triumph of despotism on both sides of the Rhine." The Berlin section also in Germany issued a statement. "We solemnly pledge that neither the sound of bugles nor the thunder of cannon will turn us from our task of making common cause with the workers of all nations, the workers of Chemnitz. We grasp with joy the hand of brotherhood extended to us by the workers of France." But we have to say that many, not all, the German working class supported a defensive, supported the opposition to the war. Many of them did support a defensive war because they saw, and there are parallels to very, very current events. I don't want to say anything which will provoke a completely different debate, but there are serious parallels with the situation that we're facing now. Many of them said this is a defensive war, and therefore they wanted to they were intent on pursuing the war despite their background internationalism, if you like. The LaSalle tendency, that was the more opportunist tendency within the German workers' movement, actually directly supported the war. The left wing, headed by Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, abstained, although later they recognized they should have voted against the war credits. What the International said was, on the German side, the war is a war of defense. They conceded that. But this only raises, they said, the further question, who put Germany to the necessity of defending herself? Who enabled Louis Bonaparte to wage war upon her? Prussia. Again, there are modern parallels or possible parallels that we might draw. Now, the French Prime Minister Thiers capitulated and signed a peace treaty with Bismarck. He ceded the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. He granted a huge, vast war indemnity and accepted the occupation of Paris by the Prussian army. And the workers of Paris, of course, had already been armed and mobilized in a National Guard, which became a popular militia. But of course, the French Prime Minister, having made the peace with Prussia, he sent regular troops to disarm the Paris proletariat. They were repulsed, and the stage was set for the first great revolution of the modern working class, the Paris Commune. As we know, I think we've had discussions recently on the events of the Commune, but in the wake of the defeat of the Paris workers, Bismarck placed 10,000 French prisoners of war at the disposal of the Versailles government to crush the Commune. At least 14,000 communards were slaughtered in the streets or summarily executed, and over 10,000 were incarcerated. Overall, it is reckoned that there were 110,000 workers, victims in Paris, who were killed, wounded, and deported. Marx exemplified the real quality of leadership, which is not primarily to teach, but to learn. In other words, he looked at the way that the Paris workers mobilized themselves and organized themselves, and far from dictating preconceived formulae, his strength was in recognizing in the spontaneous improvisation of the workers of Paris, as he put it, the political form at last discovered. Not taught to them, but discovered. The political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor. And what did he mean? Well, all public posts, administrative, judicial, and teaching, were elected by universal suffrage with the right of recall. Marx had warned against the desperate folly of taking power beforehand, knowing that it was doomed. But his testament to the history of the uprising was, working men's Paris, with its commune, will be forever celebrated as the glorious harbinger of a new society. Its martyrs are enshrined in the great heart of the working class. With the defeat of the Paris Commune, however, came the beginning of the disintegration of the International. Bakunin, in particular, the anarchist, plotted to undermine Marx. He manipulated the disintegration of the International by creating a secret organization of his own called the International Alliance of Socialist Democracy. And if you want some measure of the morality of this character, I would quote his denunciation of Marx as, quote, a German and a Jew, an authoritarian from top to toe. And he continued, this whole Jewish world, which constitutes a single exploiting sect, a sort of bloodsucker people, a collective parasite, voracious, organized in itself, not only across the frontiers of states, but even across all the differences of political opinion, this world is presently at the disposal of Marx on the one hand and of the Rothschilds on the other. Now, where have we heard that sort of talk before? So by September 1871, we had counter-revolution in France. We had a paralysis of the movement in Germany and Austria, and in Britain, a decline of revolutionary consciousness. And paradoxically, by the way, the reason why, one of the reasons why reformism took such an early and such a deadly hold on the British working class movement was precisely because it had been the first proletariat and the first revolutionary proletariat to mobilize at the time of the Chartists. And their movement in the Chartist period had wrung concessions from the ruling class in the Reform Act and the growth of the trade unions. And this led for some decades, as we know, to the link to the Liberal Party. And of course, we know the subsequent political history of the British working class. So anyway, despite the defeat of the Paris Commune and the beginning of the disintegration of the International, the prestige of the International and its indelible mark on history was not erased. It held a Congress in 1872 in The Hague, which was, of course, after the defeat of the Commune, and an immense crowd blocked the streets outside. More countries were represented at the Congress than ever before. But Marx set out his aim and his aspiration for that Congress when he said it would be a matter of life or death for the International. Before I retire, Marx said, I want at least to protect it from disintegrating elements. And he actually, the way he put it at the Congress is he argued that it would be better to abolish the General Council than to degrade its status to that of a letterbox, in the sense that some delegates said, well, it should just be a kind of sorting office for a kind of post office to disseminate reports. So they actually, Marx and Engels presented the Congress with a bit of a coup when they proposed that the seat of the council be moved from Europe to New York, because they could see what was happening, the disintegration, the demoralization, the antics of such characters as Bakunin and so on. And they thought that there's a new, fresh, virgin proletariat over the water in America, and therefore maybe the seat of the International should be transferred there. And the General Council had been, as had been put, the dread of kings and emperors, but the ebb in the revolution was strengthening demoralization, anarchism, adventurism, and the seed to reformism. And the International, said Marx, was, quote, weighing on him like an incubus. The International had an indelible, lasting legacy. It created a firm ideological foundation for the working class. It shocked the ruling class, raising forever the constant spectre of revolution. And after the shock of the Paris Commune, its panic was exposed. And I want to make a few quotes of various epitaphs that were declared by sections of the ruling class. Thiers of France declared that the French state should treat the followers of the International as the same way as the Spanish Inquisition had treated heretics. Then the British magazine, Fraser's magazine, said it was a real motive force whose hidden hand guided with a mysterious and dreaded power the whole machine of the revolution. The Catholic newspaper, The Tablet, called the International a society whose behests are obeyed by countless thousands from Moscow to Madrid, and in the New World as in the Old, whose disciples have already waged desperate war against one government, and whose proclamations pledge it to wage war against every government, the ominous, ubiquitous IWMA. The Pall Mall Gazette called it a vast conspiracy to create political communism. And after all, that was the lasting achievement of the First International. For that great movement too was wrecked by the counter-revolution. The glorious Paris Commune, the experience of which so enriched the consciousness of the cadres around Marx, fell victim to a bloody defeat. And as a direct result, the IWMA was dissolved. With the debilitation and demoralization of the proletarian core of that organization, it was likely to risk falling prey to anarchist confusion emanating from the weaker, more backward and more petty bourgeois national sections. It was time to accept the reality of world reaction and dissolve the International, keeping its banner clean. And the first step to that was, at least nominally, transferring its headquarters to the USA in 1872, but it was formally wound up in 1876. But what had it achieved? It had become a worldwide ideological workshop in which all the rival ideas could be tested out in practice against the experiences of the workers in victory and in defeat. What was needed, and then as now actually, was a forum in which to debate the issues. Marx and Engels succeeded brilliantly and almost single-handedly, because when the Second International was founded in 1889, not much more than a decade later, it brought together mass parties and mass trade unions and it stood on the foundation, at least nominally, of clear scientific socialist ideas. Its first act was to organize an international one-day general strike, an event which really did strike terror into the ruling class. The effectiveness of their work was proved that within the 7 short years or 8 short years of existence of the IWMA, by the time it was forced to shut down, they had succeeded in winning all the surviving cadres. So that when the next International was founded, it was on the basis, at least nominally, of Marxist ideas. Who still clung to the primitive anarchist ideas of Proudhon? What blind alley had Bakunin ended up in? Who had even heard the name Dühring without the prefix anti in front of it? It's a stunning tribute to Marx and Engels that they had already won the argument. Yes, it took the defeat of the Paris Commune, but their brilliant analysis of its lessons was written in the collective name of the General Council. And although the IWMA itself was dashed against the rocks of reaction, once the tide had turned and the newly emergent mass parties and trade unions had established the Socialist International in 1889, it was under the banner of the ideas of the Communist International. Of course, today we have similar tasks. We have largely a new working class, learning afresh the lessons of struggle, a new productive manufacturing industrial working class in China and on new terrain, and a new casualized working population, you could say, in the West, with the boundaries of the proletariat stretching now to encompass teachers, doctors, lecturers, barristers, as we've seen just in recent months. Marx and Engels today would have worked like us, using the internet and using Zoom. And what would they do today? Because their practice was active participation in the established labour movement, in their case, of course, the London Trades Council, building links worldwide by painfully laborious postal communication, and they worked tirelessly to establish contacts with socialist circles on the European continent, irrespective of sometimes fundamental political differences. And finally, of course, above all, political education in thorough research and scientific study, developing the theoretical foundations of Marxism. And on the day of the first worldwide general strike on May Day 1890, Engels celebrated what he considered the triumphant consummation of the historic life work of Marx and Engels. And he wrote with pride, "Today, as I write these lines, the European and American proletariat is mobilized as one army under one flag for one immediate aim." And he said, if only Marx was still by my side to see this with his own eyes. So in July 1889, on the centenary of the French Revolution, delegates representing embryonic workers' parties in 24 countries gathered in Paris under a massive red banner carrying the slogan, "Workers of the World Unite." And Marx's son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, welcomed them with the words, "We gather here not under the banner of the tricolour or any other national colours. We gather here under the banner of the red flag, the flag of the international proletariat." And finally, on the day of that first worldwide general strike in 1890, Engels celebrated what he considered the triumphant consummation of their historic life work, and he wrote with pride, "True, the International itself lived only 9 years, but that the eternal union of the proletarians of all countries created by it is still alive and lives stronger than ever, there is no better witness than this day. Because today, as I write these lines, the European and American proletariat is reviewing its fighting forces, mobilized for the first time, mobilized as one army under one flag for one immediate aim. And today's spectacle will open the eyes of the capitalists and landlords of all countries to the fact that today the working men of all countries are united indeed." So Engels could not have foreseen the betrayals and defeats that were still to come as the storms approached of the impending 20th century and the epoch of world wars, revolutions, and counter-revolutions. In the context of imperialist crisis, that international was soon to become the arena for raging political debates and eventually, of course, a catastrophic split. Its members soon found themselves facing one another, not in debates at international congresses, but in the blood-soaked battlefields of Europe, and not in the language of resolutions and votes, but in that of bullets, poison gas, and bombs. As late as November 1912, as the storm clouds of the coming World War were gathering, at an extraordinary International Socialist Congress at Basel, the Socialist International, the Second International, unanimously warned the ruling classes of Europe, let the governments remember that they cannot unleash a war without danger to themselves. The proletarians consider it a crime to fire at each other for the profits of the capitalists, the ambitions of dynasties, or the greater glory of secret diplomatic treaties. Less than 2 years later, its ringing promises of a Europe-wide general strike against the impending imperialist war were betrayed. The Social Democrats of all the belligerent countries swallowed their speechifying, and they tamely swung into support behind their kings, generals, and ministers. The International was dead, and millions of workers died in the ensuing bloodbath. But what happened subsequently is another story, which maybe we'll have an opportunity to discuss on a future occasion. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Roger. Very interesting look back at the First International and looking at the situation, the international situation today. You do wonder, why on earth haven't we got one now, over 150 years later? And it was needed more than ever, but we're quite far away from that. It was interesting that you mentioned it failed. Of course, it failed, the First International, as did the second, but the second reestablished on a higher level. And this is part of our problem, isn't it? We'll have to fail and fail again and fail again until we actually succeed eventually, but it will be a struggle. Comrades, if you want to come in with ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand. I'm going to ask you a couple of things, Roger, to get the ball rolling. Because I know you're making a point about Marx and Engels being not sectarian and working with people who are not Marxists and not fully formed communists, etc. And you mentioned a few times this idea, we have to be bold in matter but mild in manner. But they did write all the way through, didn't they? They argued all the way through for a communist program, for the Communist League to have a communist program, or do I misunderstand that?
Yes, they did, but they were very cautious in their way. That above all, they wanted to keep the International together. Above all, they saw that unless they brought all the revolutionary or aspiring revolutionary organizations together, and all the workers and protest movements together into a single body, that was the arena in which to discuss against the background of objective events, to test out their ideas and their rival ideas against the practice of the struggle as it unfolded. And as I say, within really it was only 7 years that the International really existed in full measure. And in that 7 years, they completely transformed the whole outlook of the working class. And that was a tribute to their genius in the way, and also their tact. I mean, it was not simply, they did not just lecture the working class, but it was patient exploration, which was their watchword.
What in terms of publications then or something? Did the International have its own publication, or did the individual groups involved have publications? Was there joint leaflets or something like that?
As far as I know, I mean, of course, each of the national groups and each of the rival groups within each nation and so on, they had their own organs and publications. The General Council issued resolutions and statements from time to time. I don't think they had a regular publication. I may be wrong there. I don't think so.
Because it is, I mean, it was obviously, pre-internet, if you don't have a newspaper, I wonder how they got their resolutions out to people in the different countries. I mean, to your knowledge, was there some kind of attempt to spread it amongst the members in the various countries?
Well, of course, they had great, tactical problems. If they'd had the internet, just imagine what they could have done.
But did Marx and Engels publish, for example, some of these resolutions to your knowledge in the Jahrbücher and all of these kind of things?
Oh yes, I mean they were constantly writing articles. I mean they, as you know, Marx was a correspondent of various journals worldwide, including in the USA. But I think the resolutions were published. Of course, they had to use the post, and I mean, actually, I know that in the early days, Marx and Engels, not only a question of the slow speed of the postal delivery, but the cost. It was actually very expensive for them, but somehow, they managed.
Oh, there's some interesting stories about the post. Actually, at some stage when Marx was in London and Engels in Manchester, I mean, they had post 2-3 times a day. That's actually they sent each other letters and answering in the same day and stuff. That was quite interesting. Just quickly on the anarchists. I mean, that battle is very interesting and very important politically, and it's of course still ongoing. Anarchism is still a popular trend. I mean, Marx and Engels wrote against the Bakunists and the Proudhonists for some time, and quite openly during those years. And I just looked it up before the meeting. I mean, Marx described Bakunin's ideas of the future. I mean, he was very detailed. Some of these comrades, Proudhon and Bakunin, wrote quite detailed blueprints for what communism would look like, their view of communism. So they had quite a rigid idea. Marx called it a barrack room communism of Bakunin's, where you had to, you feed all the children are being fed at 8 a.m. and then at 12 noon, and you have to do the laundry collectively, and you have to live in houses that look like this. He drew up sort of architectural designs of how the houses under communism would look like, which is bit mad, but also quite, very rigid. And this is my idea. And he called Marx authoritarian, which is quite interesting, because if you draw blueprints like that, it kind of shows who the real authoritarian is. But I think the main issue Marx had with Bakunin and Proudhon was, I mean, you touched on it, but perhaps you could explain it a bit more, is the idea that the working class isn't the class necessarily that will make revolution, as I understand it. So Proudhon and Bakunin had what was exaggerated by Marx. How do you view that political struggle between, the need to focus on the working class or not, and political action?
Well, as you say, I mean, they represented pre-proletarian aspirations towards struggle, if you like. But Bakunin in particular, I mean, he was actually, from what I understand, I mean, he was a very colorful, charismatic figure, but he was the kind of guy, we all know the kind of person who just jumped from country to country to country, defying the police state and getting himself arrested, and it was all action, action, action. He had a contempt for theory. He had he, as you say, I mean, he regarded Marx as a kind of boring old professor we could learn nothing from. And he didn't base himself on any kind of theoretical grasp of the development of capitalist society and of how the working class could emancipate itself.
And they certainly didn't see political struggle of the working class, or strikes, or any kind of political struggles as the way to get towards socialism. How did he, to your knowledge, envisage, how do you need an organization? Even how would that organization come about if it's not through political struggle? Is it just through will? You have to just will it enough. I mean, that's still quite popular, isn't it? Yeah,
I mean, we've seen, that sort of thing manifests itself again and again, doesn't it? Kind of lumpen exhibitionism.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple of comrades now with their hands up. If anybody else wants to come in, and you know, there are no stupid questions. As you've seen, I've asked quite a lot of them already. So feel free to come in and ask or comment.
You might get a few stupid answers too.
There are no stupid answers either. Well, at least we don't call them that. Hi, Carol.
Hi, we're all on a learning curve here. Yeah, you took my thunder, Tina. I was going to ask about Bakunin because Roger had mentioned him so many times, and I wanted some more information. But I think we've got that information now. But I do have another couple of questions. One is an observation, a couple of observations. You said that Marx learnt from the Paris Commune, and I was just going to say yes, absolutely, because before the Paris Commune, he thought that universal suffrage would sort everybody, all the problems out. And he realized, no, it's got to be universal suffrage, but there's got to be the delegates that are elected have got to be mandated, and they can't move. They've got to do what they've been mandated to do by the people they represent. And there should be recall as well. There's got to be the right of recall of those representatives. So yes, I totally agree with you. Marx really learned from the working class, from what happened in the Paris Commune. That's just one example I can think of. The other thing I wanted to ask you, do you think, I mean, it seems that this International, the Paris Commune, the International was doing such wonderful work. The working class was really moving, and then we had World War I. Do you think that World War I was in a way a reaction by the establishment to bring down, to put the lid on this rising up of the working class and socialism? Do you think that would be, do you think that's the case? The other thing I wanted to say was you went back in the English revolutionary tradition, you went back to the Chartists, but I think you can go back much further than that to the Levellers, because the Levellers were really the first true revolution in England, where they got rid of the king, they got rid of the House of Lords. In fact, they had the king beheaded, didn't they? Although they didn't really want that. They also had a written constitution, which sadly never came before Parliament. So I would argue that you could go back beyond the Chartists to the Levellers, to the very first true revolution in England in relatively modern times. Anyway, thank you very much, Roger. Your talk was brilliant. Really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Roger, do you want to reply to?
Well, yes, I mean, there's a lot. First of all, this question of learning from the working class. I would say the definition, if you like, the distinction between a revolutionary and what do we call them, sectarian, is this question of the relationship of the activist to the mass movement, to the working class. Now, exactly, Marx learned from the working class, and he said so. He didn't apologize for the fact that he in the quote actually that I quoted already, when he said that actually that we've learned from the working class. I can't remember the exact word now, but we've learned from the working class that is the way in which the working class would exercise its power. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not the only example in the history of the workers' movement. So I'm thinking there are many, many, many examples, but it's the same thing. Again, the sectarian comes with preconceived ideas and thinks we have to come and teach the working class and tell them how it's done and so on. When the Russian Revolution broke out, the first Russian Revolution in 1905, the workers of Petrograd set up the Soviet, set up their own workers' council to run run their revolution and to run society. At least that was their aspiration. The local Bolsheviks who'd learned, who I'm talking about the local Bolsheviks on the spot, who thought, that we've been studying Marxism, we know, and they said, no, we can't have this, because these Soviets, they're outside the control of the party. They would undermine the leading role of the vanguard party. And it was Lenin, of course. Trotsky had no doubts about that. He was actually the chair of the Petrograd Soviet. And Lenin also, I mean, he corrected the Soviets very corrected the local Bolsheviks very sharply and said, no, the Soviets are the means by which the working class will exercise its power. And of course, they changed their slogan when it came to 1917. Their main slogan was all power to the Soviets. But there are many, many, many more examples we can give. And that, I think, is the litmus test of who is a revolutionary and who is a sectarian. But you don't come with preconceived ideas. Of course, it doesn't mean you become completely passive, but it means that you have to generalize, you have to watch, you have to keep the finger on the pulse, and you have to learn the lessons and generalize and embody that in your ideology and your outlook. Oh yes, when you said about, well, it didn't start with the Chartists. Of course, I mean, you can go back before the Levellers too. You can go back to John Ball and the peasants' revolts in the 14th century too. But the question about the Chartists, it was the first organized movement based on the working class, based on the industrial working class. That's really the point that I was trying to make. I can't remember what was the third point now.
World War I was one fought against the working class.
Well, I don't think that was the principal explanation for the World War. But I mean, of course, the ruling class knows that chauvinism and nationalism are their main instrument, and of course, racism and communalism are their main weapon in order to divide the working class. Absolutely.
But that was a imperialist dividing up the world. I think that was the reason for World War I. Unfortunately, the working class was not strong enough to have been the reason. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much.
Steve Freeman.
I'm muting myself. Yes. Thank you, Tina, and thanks, Roger. I'm not going to contradict you. I hope to add a couple of things, just a couple of thoughts, really, to what you said. It was a very good presentation, and we picked up on all the key points. But I want to just begin by saying, or emphasising the point that you made, that this wasn't a socialist or communist organisation. It was rather more of a broader church, if I like to use that word, that Labour Party term. I mean, it wasn't as broad as the Labour Party, but anyway, a united front, you could say, of a whole range of things, a whole range of groups. And you mentioned Democrats, Chartists, Irish Republicans, Mazzini's Italian Republicans, as well as trade unions. And then you had communists, you had Owenites, Proudhonists, Blanquists, Lassalle, I think you mentioned Lassalle, and of course Bakunin. So it was quite a broad, and the thing that seems to me to kind of united this rather disparate bag of group of people was the fact that there was a struggle for democracy going on across Europe at that time, as it always has been, by the working class. So Marx was bringing in that aspect of the important role of the working class. Now, the first thing that started the First International, I think, was the Polish uprising of 1863. That was the occasion that brought these people together, brought these comrades together to set up the First International. So that's the first thing. The struggle for democracy in Poland was crucial. And then I noticed, as I was just looking in the back of this, there was one of the first things they did, I noticed, quite interested me, that there was an address from the International, I'll read this a little bit out for a second, address from the International Working Men's Association to Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, and it was written by Marx. And it just says, "Sir, we congratulate the American people upon your re-election by a large majority. If resistance to slave power was the watchword of your first election, the triumphant war cry of your re-election is death to slavery." And it's quite clear. From the commencement of the Titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the aspirations of their class. So I just give that as a link, if you like, that the thing that's going on here is the struggle for democracy, of which the anarchists and the communists become, I think, the core argument in all of this. And I think the central struggle that's within this, that comes out of this, is a struggle. As I've mentioned before, or I've called them before, the Republican communists, which I count Marx and Engels, and the anarcho-communists here, which is Bakunin. And of course, it's the Paris Commune that brings that distinction to a head, because Marx believed you had to replace the existing state with a democratic republic, and Bakunin simply thought you should abolish the state and abolish all politics as authoritarian and dictatorial, etc. Ironically, I think Tina said, or maybe you said as well, that Bakunin accuses Marx of being an authoritarian, but in fact, the anarchy of Bakunin was the real authoritarianism that came out of this. And that Marx discovered, as you said, in the Paris Commune, the form of a democratic republic. The ability to replace the existing state with a democratic republic was the direction that Marx went in. And of course, that then brought the split of the International, of the First International, as you outlined, Roger. So I think that's a point, a theme that's actually gone through this series, is the development of Marx's ideas on republicanism and democracy, and his battle with the anarcho-communists that want to abolish the state as opposed to replacing the state with a democratic republic as a transitional form towards full communism. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Steve. Do you want to reply to anything, Roger?
Well, yeah, this is a debate which has gone on, for a long time and everything. I mean, I there's nothing that Steve said that is wrong, but it's incomplete. I mean, the idea, I think we have to understand that Marx was a socialist. It was the objective was for the working class to take power. It was not simply a question of democratic republics and so on. Of course, he was staunchly and strongly in favor of the suppression and the extinction of slavery, because that was a relic of pre-capitalist society. You couldn't do anything. There was no question of movement towards socialism till you cleared out feudal relics and the relics of slavery and all kinds of backwardness. But it was a movement of the working class, for the working class, to abolish capitalism and to create the foundation for socialism. That's I mean, we can go on a long time about this, and no doubt the discussion will continue. But I think what you're doing is you're kind of emasculating the heritage of Marxism. If you confine the whole analysis of the First International and of the Paris Commune and so on as simply a question of a struggle for democracy. It was a struggle. It was a hugely important stride forward in the development of the working class towards socialism. And when you say, well, it was just a democratic forum and so on, it was a democratic forum, and democracy, and Marx and Engels were in favor of the fullest possible democracy towards a particular end. The point was not for endless round the circle debating of the same issues over and over again. It was because it was a debate and a democratic discussion in order to reach a conclusion. And that's exactly what happened in the 7 years of the real existence of the First International between 1864 and 1871. In 1864, as I said, it began as the most disparate possible group with all kinds of eccentric and weird and wonderful different cliques and sects and all the rest of it. And it ended up so clear that Marx and Engels had won the argument, and that when the next International was created, only a decade and a half later, it was firmly and clearly on the foundations, at least in words. And of course, we saw what happened later, but that's a different story. But it was based on the ideas of scientific socialism and of Marxism, and all these kind of weird, eccentric notions of Bakunism and Proudhonism anarchism and putschism and all the rest of it, they became a matter of history. From that time onward, Marxism was the ideology of the working class for decades ahead. So there we are.
Yeah, shame we're not there at the moment. I'm afraid we've gone backward there, haven't we? But certainly the Second International was hugely influenced by that. Just a quick discussion on this then. You mentioned that, and that was interesting that they had about a couple of hundred members, and the bourgeoisie, the establishment, the media thought they must have 5 to 8 million members, which in one way you could say is probably a bit like the Socialist Labour Party, Arthur Scargill, when he counted every single member of his affiliated mine workers union when it came to their Congress, and you had like 30,000 people voting in this tiny little room, which is of course crazy. But I think it was more a reflection of that there were a number of unions represented, not individually, but represented politically by their leaders. Or was it simply a misinformation, or that they made it bigger than it was in terms of creating a scare? Or where does this discrepancy come from?
Well, I mean, as I think I said, I mean, individual members was one thing, and the individual activists who could be numbered by the end of it, probably in the thousands, maybe tens of thousands. But the question of the affiliated organizations, I mean, it still wasn't 5 to 8 million, but it was, but the authority, I mean, they were the only workers' organizations in existence. They were all allied to the General Council. I mean, even as I say, apart from LaSalle, I mean, all the other, even for that, for a period, Bakunin and Mazzini, who also turned against Marx, by the way, quite savagely. And Garibaldi's movement to unify Italy, all of that came under the umbrella of the First International. But with those, if you took the affiliation of all those organizations, it was probably hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions, but not 5 to 8 million. I mean, that was what it showed was the quite justified panic and terror in the minds of the bourgeoisie, because they saw for the first time, they saw the working class could mobilize and could organize and could unite across borders. And that's what scared them.
Even more so, of course, the Second International, which was really a force, a huge
it was millions, yes.
Society, yes. And then, as you outlined, national chauvinism, etc., made the German Social Democrats, I think, one of the first to fold and support the war of their government. Looking forward, then, I mean, it is, as we said at the beginning, it is so obvious that in a period like this, where we're heading towards World War III, etc., where we're in a war between Russia and Ukraine, which most people can see is being pushed along with a particular agenda of China next, etc. And the working class is doing nothing. I mean, there's, it's currently there's some, I know we roughly agree with this, but I'm still quite shocked that some people think they have to support Russia. Some people think they have to support Ukraine and, NATO and US imperialism. And the voices of working class are sort of an internationalist point of view, which says neither of these two have anything to do with our forces, with our working class, is not really represented very well. How can we move forward to I don't know which number international we're at now. It depends on which ones you count, doesn't it? There have been quite a few attempts to set it up. But where do you see, us going, the international working class, in terms of trying to get its act together?
Well, I mean, absolutely, I agree with what you say. That the, I mean, I don't. But obviously, the question of Ukraine is going to open up a whole new discussion, and we've had that, and we will no doubt to quite a considerable degree, do that in future too. But I do think, I mean, the lessons are so clear. As we know, when Lenin heard that the German Social Democrats had voted for the war credits for the Kaiser, he couldn't believe it. He thought it was a forgery by the German General Staff. He thought it was out of the question. He could not conceive of it. And I must say that I am astounded. I'm not comparing myself to Lenin, but I think all of us are astounded by the positions that some people have taken, either, as you say, to support either one of the warring partners. The very first thing for socialists is internationalism, and that we are against imperialist wars, so that we stand in favour of the unity of the working class to overthrow the ruling classes of all the existing powers. And I mean, there are parallels, particularly I think there's a parallel with the Franco-Prussian War that we discussed today, with the Ukraine. That was a precursor to the First World War. This is, I mean, I don't want to be fatalistic. I mean, it may not come to a Third World War is inevitable eventually if capitalism is not destroyed. But of course, you know, we don't, we're not, you know, we were not already preaching doom and gloom. I mean, the working class has to take the opportunity in the interim to mobilize itself and prepare itself politically and organizationally in order to prevent a bloodbath, which would probably be the end of human civilization. Perhaps I won't say any more now.
On that happy note, well, it's things change quickly, isn't it, in particular periods, and should it come to a new war, I mean, I'm sure some form of international resistance of the working class would take shape. Although, as you say, the reactions of many on the left is quite shocking. But there are seeds of the fight back, and as communist socialists, we are eternal optimists. So we are looking forward to, you know, education forums like this are necessary, supporting working class struggles, when if they take place is of course another part of this, and the two go together. And what's missing perhaps is the organization of the Marxists in some kind of political organization, but that also is of course linked to working class struggles. Thank you very much, Roger. There are no more questions. We're finishing.
Can I ask one question, Tina?
Go on then. Go on.
Since actually this discussion is already beginning to verge on the question of what happened with the First World War and so on, do we have plans to have a meeting on what happened to the Second International and then perhaps the Third International? Because I'd be very happy to participate in any such meetings.
Sounds good. Perhaps we have to do that outside the series, and we'll discuss it else, because this is the series that focuses on kind of on Marx and his work, etc. I was just going to run through, but we can do, you know, we can have additional meetings, and that would be very useful, I think, on a Tuesday, perhaps. I'll certainly put it to comrades who are on the organizing group for this series. What we're doing next week is 2 days before the wonderful coronation of our King Charles III, which will be next Thursday. We're looking at Marx and the monarchy, because Marx certainly and Engels were very keen Republicans. And, you know, I know you disagree with Steve Freeman a little bit on his emphasis on republicanism, etc., but they were certainly Republicans and were arguing against the monarchy, as well as obviously being socialists and not just Republicans. It was part of their socialism, their fight for communism. That's going to be with Ian Spencer and Kevin Bean. If you can have a look at our website for some reading on those issues to prepare. And then in reply also to somebody on the chat who was asking about how do Marxists strike a balance with nature, etc. We'll be looking at Marx and nature the week after. Then we're just in the middle of drawing up the third section of our program, where we'll be looking at, we're calling it the transition, which is the transition from, obviously, from here to communism, socialism, whatever we call it, And we're in this transition already, if you will. There are the seeds of socialism within capitalism, and we're looking at all of those issues. So we are carrying on well into the summer. We've got a program sorted, and we'll be putting it on our website and outside Facebook, etc. very soon. So we hope to see you next Thursday to talk about the monarchy and how to get rid of it. And that would also help us perhaps to deal with the madness that's going to ensue in the British media, and it won't be very pleasant. Comrades, thank you for joining us tonight, and see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you, Roger.
Bye, comrades. Bye-bye.